Let's get some more now on the news that the US investigating France's plans to tax digital giants. Or Business Editor Stephen Carroll is here to explain it all to us a bit more. Stephen, first of all, what is the tax? How will it work?
Well, it's worth saying as well, this is not a new idea. The idea of taxing big digital companies has been around for quite a while. It's been something that's in the French political consciousness for some time, but it really became concrete towards the end of last year. One of the big challenges of having this tax is deciding exactly what to tax. And this bill puts forward two broad parts of the definition of what are digital revenues, which will be subject to this taxation. One is tax on platforms. So essentially, these are companies that provide services connecting users, like, for example, think of Airbnb connecting homeowners to people who want to rent property, Uber connecting drivers to passengers, that sort of thing. It's that sort of revenue that will be tackled by platforms. Interestingly, in the case of Apple, it means that only a part of their revenue will be subject to this tax, and that's the part dealing with the App Store that connects developers to users, but it won't be applied to things like sales of iPhones, which is of course the biggest part of Apple's revenue. The other broad house in this is digital advertising services, the collecting, the use of data for targeted ads. It's a market that's dominated by Google and Facebook, so they're the main ones who will be subject to that tax. So that's what the tax is. The next question is who's going to pay it. The thresholds that have been set by this law mean that only the biggest players in the market will have to pay this. They will have to qualify with digital revenues, so those revenues we were just describing will need to be over 750 million euros globally and 25 million euros in France. Now, one of the reasons the United States isn't happy with this plan is because the majority of companies that will fall under it will be American. It's estimated to be about 30 companies will be subject to this tax. All of the names that you might suspect: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Uber, Airbnb, all American companies. There are companies from other parts of the world also going to be subject to it: British companies, Japanese, Norwegian, Dutch, but only one French company on the list. That's Criteo. They are a digital advertising services company.
But we're already hearing criticism, notably from the US, in relation to this tax, and yet France has decided to plough ahead with it pretty much on its own.
Yeah, now that's not what they wanted to do, it has to be said. There are other countries in Europe also planning similar taxes, the United Kingdom, Spain and Austria among them. And the G20 last month did actually agree that digital taxation was something that they would have to tackle in the future. So the idea of taxing these companies is something there's widespread support for. The general opinion is the current tax system doesn't work for these sort of companies because they're international. They're not physically necessarily based in many of the countries where they work, which means that collecting taxation is not the same as with a traditional company where, in a supermarket, it's easy to tell where the chain of goods go so that you can tax them properly. So it is a big challenge. That the difference of opinion, though, tends to come on how you execute this tax. France has chosen to go down this road because they couldn't win EU-wide support for it. They tried over a series of months to get support at an EU-wide level, but at least 4 countries in the EU blocked that effort. They include Ireland, which is the country which, of course, hosts the European headquarters of most of these companies. The Irish government's argument is this shouldn't be tackled at just an EU level. It needs to come at an OECD level, the group of rich countries that are members of that organisation based here in Paris. They're waiting for the OECD to come up with their proposal for digital taxation. That's due in the next year, and they say that they'll be willing to act on that. France says it can't wait and it needs to go ahead now.
Okay, it'll be interesting to see to what extent others may follow. Turning to other business news now, and the head of the American Central Bank has given markets something to cheer about.
Jerome Powell warning lawmakers in Washington of continuing uncertainty facing the US economy. As expected, he didn't talk directly about cutting interest rates, but that's how the markets are interpreting his comments. On Wall Street, we saw the S&P 500 hit a record high after he'd been speaking. Let's take a look at how markets are interpreting all of that in trading today. In Europe, we've got gains at the start of trading. We can see that trend from Wall Street carrying over into trading today in Europe. Now, there had been some fears that better than expected figures on employment in the United States might have put the brakes on that hoped for rate cut, but not so if we take the hints that were given by Jerome Powell yesterday. In Europe today, oil and gas shares among those seeing rises. That's due to an increase in oil prices that we saw in trading on Wednesday. In Asia, a largely similar picture, gains across all markets now. The Shanghai Composite also turning into the green in the last hour. Also, again, investor optimism there about a rate cut.
More trouble, Stephen, for Deutsche Bank as the United States begins an investigation into the German lender.
This is according to the Wall Street Journal, which is reporting the US Justice Department is looking into whether the bank may have broken foreign corruption or anti-money laundering rules in its work for the controversial Malaysian Development Fund 1MDB. Now, Deutsche helped to raise $1.2 billion for the fund in 2014. It says it's cooperating fully with all inquiries. The state-funded 1MDB became a global scandal when it emerged that billions of dollars had been siphoned out of the fund between 2009 and 2014. Already a former managing director at Goldman Sachs has admitted his role in that fraud.
Meanwhile, one company having a somewhat fun day on the markets, Nintendo.
That's right, the gaming company's shares up 4% in Tokyo. That's after they unveiled their latest console. It's the Switch Lite, a cheaper version of the handheld Switch console. It'll sell for just under $200. That's around $100 cheaper than the regular version. This console has been a huge seller for Nintendo so far. It has a huge library of games, including classics like Mario Brothers and Zelda, most of which will be playable on the Switch Lite as well. Nintendo, generally speaking, in a very good place. Their shares have risen by more than 40% this year. But it is facing increased competition. Sony and Microsoft, two of its main rivals, have joined forces to try and compete with Nintendo in this area.
Okay, Stephen, thanks a lot for that business update. Stephen Carroll, our business editor there.